Hello, Tom. What motivated you to write Paul, and why have you written it? Have you always been curious about who Paul is on a personal level?
Yeah, I guess ever since I was a student and first really encountering Paul and wrestling with his letters, there's always this sense of this energetic, somewhat strange to us man who's going around doing all the things he did and then dashing off these letters to people in distress or in need of a rebuke or whatever it is. And so I did my doctorate on Paul about, I don't know, it feels like 90 years ago, but I suppose it's about 40 actually. And that really got me into quite a lot of the intellectual work of how is his mind working. But always behind that, there's the sense of who is he and how does it all fit together? And the older I've got and the more I've studied the worlds that Paul lived in, the Jewish world, the Greek world, the Roman world, I've had a sense of Paul as a multidimensional person, and I think often in church we just think of him as a theological brain and a praying heart, but we don't really think about what it was like to meet him on the street, or if you went into the little shop where he was making tents, what would he be doing, and so on. And the more I've studied all that stuff, the more fascinating it's become. So actually the model for this, if I have a model, is that there was some novels a few years ago by Robert Harris. They've now made a movie of them on the life of Cicero. Imperium, I think, is the new movie. And those three novels, Imperium, Lustrum and Dictator, get you into the world of first century Rome, and you feel what it's like walking down the street to the courthouse and this and that. And then when you meet Cicero the writer, you understand him because you've lived in his world. And I wanted to do something of the same for Paul, and I hope I've had a little bit of that effect in this book.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And it's been noted that one of the most wondrous features of the book is the way that you paint Paul as a real person, you know, with a complex life and complex issues. When you were writing it, did you always feel that you were writing the book objectively? You know, did you feel that you were always sort of in character, or did you have the opportunity to sort of step back and assess Paul?
Both history and biography are a constant to and fro. It's like a sort of circle, because you're trying to make sure you're hearing what's actually there rather than imposing your interpretation. But then, in order to make sense of it, you're trying out ideas and then coming back to the material does that work. And this is how actually all knowledge works, whether it's scientific knowledge or whatever. Letting the material speak, trying out hypotheses as to how it fits together, coming back again. So, in a sense, I hope I've succeeded in transcending either objectivity or subjectivity, and that I hope this is real historical biography. But of course, I'm involved with it because all historians are involved with their subject matter. We're not just flies on the wall. So there is a rich engagement. But if anyone were to ask, as people sometimes have, are you making Paul in your own image? I would say absolutely not. Paul I'm describing is quite unlike me. And I'm very glad I didn't have to live the sort of life he lived.
Fantastic, thank you very much. The book is currently ranking as a bestseller on Amazon, and you know it's been so well received very widely, and it just confirmed that the book is actually filling a gap for people and their understanding of the apostle. Do you think Christians are more curious about Paul as they read and interact with the book, and what do you make of the reception?
Yeah, I haven't actually been really involved with the reception. I've been hugely busy the last 6 months since the book came out, doing quite other things. So people have said to me from time to time, oh, it's doing well, and I thought, oh, good, but sorry, I've got to get on with this now. So I haven't really looked very much at that. I've been fascinated by the response I've had from my own family and people that I know who've read it, and often people who know the letters quite well and have preached on Romans or Galatians or Corinthians or whatever, but have said, I never really put that bit together. I never really thought why that felt so uncomfortable for him at that point. So trying to get into the human story, I think people have found very exciting. And it's almost like a novel, really, but it writes itself. I mean, I didn't write it as a novel, it's a biography, but it has certain novelistic features, I think.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And did you have to do any additional research for Paul in particular, as you've written so many other books, and you're obviously an ancient Greek scholar as well who studied context and history. So if you could just explain a little of the additional research that you put into it.
Yeah, when you're doing a biography, again and again you're scene setting. So here comes Paul to Corinth, and I know a fair amount about Corinth, but because there are certain things I don't hold in my head, like statistics, I can never remember how many thousand people lived in ancient Corinth. I always have to look up that stuff. And while I was doing that, I had quite fun, because as a historian it is fun, grubbing around and seeing, exactly the dimensions of some of these cities and how many people lived there and what their main occupations were and so on. So I did quite a bit of the scene setting research, and also there are certain bits of Paul's letters which, I've written on all of them at various stages, but coming back now, this bit is really important for the biography. So what precisely was going on there? So I was digging at some bits which I hadn't done in some of my previous writings, and that was really fun. And one of the things I changed my mind on was the question of whether Paul really got to Spain. He says he's going to Spain, but there's no hard evidence that he got there. But actually, by the end of writing the book, I was convinced he did. And that's because of somebody writing The Next Generation, Clement, who says, and he was living in Rome, who says that Paul reached the limits of the East and the West. Now, to anyone in Rome, the limits of the West means Spain. And he's writing maybe max 30 years after Paul, and I think he knew that he did.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And from your viewpoint, Tom, have your opinions or view on Paul changed since you wrote the book, and if so, how?
Yeah, I don't think since I wrote the book, because as I say, it's really very recent. But as it's sort of settled down in my mind, I have had this sense of Paul as this fully rounded character, and particularly, as I say in the book, but I've been kind of living with the fact of having said it, he was obviously quite a high maintenance friend. He would be a great friend to have, but life would never be dull when he was around, and there may be sometimes we actually want our lives to be a bit dull, and Paul would never let you get away with that. So I've sort of had this sense that people loved him, but maybe when he got on a boat to go somewhere else, they, phew, now we can have a bit of peace and quiet, just possibly, in the nicest possible way.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And as a book, I think one of the things that I sort of recognise as we've been looking at the book and reading it within our own office at Preach, it has an appeal to both the Christian and non-Christian market alike. How did that influence you putting together the book to sort of get that right balance between the historical, biblical, and also that appeal to people who probably have never heard anything about?
Yes, I didn't really think much about that as I was writing the book. I was just trying to get the story right and show how it all fits together and how it makes coherent sense of him as a person. He's not just a random maverick doing stupid, incoherent things. But I was aware that part of the point of all of this is that he is a major figure of ancient history. He's one of the top public intellectuals of all time. And we think about a public intellectual as somebody who writes op-ed pieces for newspapers or is always on the radio or whatever, helping people think things through, supposedly. And when you say go back to the 1st century BC or AD, well, the people who are doing that, people like Cicero or Seneca, the great philosophers, the great teachers, and Paul absolutely ranks in the middle of that. So that, I read Seneca, I don't expect to agree with him all the time, but my goodness, he's interesting and challenging. And I would hope that people from totally outside the Christian faith community would be able to read this and think, well, I'm not sure where he's got all this funny stuff about Jesus from, but clearly he's a man of substance intellectually, who we've got to take seriously. And I hope it's going to have that effect.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And as you have put the book out and finished it, do you feel that there are any sort of unanswered questions or things that you possibly think, maybe I haven't quite cracked that particular element? Is there anything that you could...
That's interesting. I was coming down to London on the train yesterday. I was rereading it quickly, and that was one of the things I was thinking was, where are the gaps? I think actually the gaps are where the gaps are. Like all ancient history, our sources don't allow us to give a kind of a day-by-day thing. I mean, contrast with, I read a biography of Churchill recently, and we know pretty well what Churchill was doing at 10 o'clock on August the 24th, 1943. We've got it absolutely. Well, there's nothing like that in ancient history. Even with Julius Caesar or whatever, we just don't have that. And with Paul, obviously, there are 10 years when he goes back to Tarsus and we don't know what happened. And he's, I assume, in his middle 20s till in his middle 30s. Those are hugely formative years and we have no information about them. Wouldn't it be wonderful if one day some archaeologist would dig up something and say, guess what we've got? Paul's private diary from his late 20s. That's a novel somebody should write. Yes. Because it was obviously a painful time, because we suspect that his own family, when he went back, didn't come to share his belief in Jesus, so that when later he's writing Romans, he says, I'm in constant pain because of my kinsfolk who don't believe. And I think that comes straight out of that period, but we just don't know what sort of conversations they had. So there's all sorts of things we would like to know more. And also, did he make a second trip back to the West, even though he says he's going to Spain and that's it? We don't know. Maybe he did. So there's gaps there to be filled in.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And lastly, why did you think it was important that Paul the Biography came out and that you did that book and you put it out into the public sphere?
Yeah, I've written obviously quite a few other things about Paul, some of them rather big academic things with lots of footnotes and bibliography and so on. And various people, including some fellow scholars, have said to me, this is all very well, but there's people who might well like to know what you're talking about, but will never actually work through that big book. And so it was in the back of my mind that one day I might write a shorter, more popular book on Paul. But I've written other short, popular books about Paul in a different register. And then one of the publishers for whom I work said, actually, we think a biography would be a good idea. And I thought, that's a different sort of challenge. Trying to get in someone's mind and heart and imagination and their mental furniture. And so, yes, to begin with, that was a bit scary as I was sketching it out. But I think, you know, we all, I say we all, not everyone, but most people like biographies and autobiographies because we all have our own story in our heads, and to sense somebody else's story rumbling along inevitably has resonances with ours, and relations with family and ambitions and vocations and disappointments and thwartings and suffering, and you know. So this is, I hope, a good vehicle for people to find themselves getting inside the mind of Paul, so that when they then open one of the letters, instead of thinking, what is all this about, they think, oh yes, of course, this is what he would want to say to these people right now. And my aim would be that the letters will then spring up in 3 dimensions, and people will find themselves living in the letters rather than reading them at a kind of intellectual distance. And if it has that effect, I will be delighted.
Fantastic, thank you very much.